I was 19 weeks pregnant when my younger sister, Natalie, ran a red light in my husband's car and crashed into an SUV outside downtown Boston. At the time, no one told me she had been texting Henry seconds before the collision. My mother only said Natalie had suffered internal bleeding and might need emergency surgery. By the time Henry and I reached Boston Memorial Hospital, my legs were trembling so badly that I had to hold on to the registration desk. The pregnancy had been difficult from the beginning. Severe nausea had followed me well into my second trimester, leaving me anemic, dehydrated, and almost 10 pounds below the weight my obstetrician wanted me to maintain. Henry knew all of that. He had seen me faint in our bathroom. He had attended the appointment where Dr. Brooks warned that another serious episode of dehydration could put both me and the baby at risk. Yet during the entire drive to the hospital, Henry never once asked whether I was feeling well. He kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other around his phone, checking for updates from Natalie at every red light. My mother met us outside the emergency department. Her face was wet with tears, and there was blood on the sleeve of her beige coat. "They're searching for compatible blood," she said. "Your father and I were tested, but neither of us can donate." A nurse led me into a small examination room and drew several vials of blood. 20 minutes later, an emergency physician returned with the results. Natalie had a rare blood type complicated by an unusual antibody. My blood was compatible, but the doctor immediately made it clear that I was not an acceptable donor. "You're pregnant, your hemoglobin is well below the normal range, and your blood pressure is already low," he explained. "We will not collect blood from you." My mother stared at him. "But Stephanie is the only match in the family. We have located compatible units through the regional blood center. They are being transported now." "How long will that take?" my father demanded. "Approximately 90 minutes. My father's voice rose. "And what happens if Natalie gets worse before then?" "The surgical team is monitoring her closely. Her condition is serious, but she is stable enough to wait." That should have ended the discussion. Instead, my mother began insisting that blood from a relative had to be safer than blood from a stranger. The physician explained that a directed donation was not automatically safer, and that collecting blood from a pregnant woman with severe anemia would create an unnecessary risk. My parents barely seemed to hear him. Henry stood near the foot of Natalie's bed, staring at the monitors. He was the founder of Palmer Surgical Systems, a medical technology company that supplied equipment to private clinics throughout New England. He had spent enough time around doctors to understand that the physician was not being overly cautious. When I asked Henry to take me home, he looked at me as though I had said something shameful. "Natalie may need surgery," he said. "The hospital found blood for her. It hasn't arrived yet. The doctor said she can wait." Henry glanced toward Natalie. She was pale, but she was conscious, and a nurse was adjusting the foreline near her wrist. "What if her condition changes? Then she's already in the best place possible." Henry lowered his voice. "Patrick Nolan's surgical center has an emergency blood processing unit. He may be willing to help." I knew the name. Dr. Patrick Nolan ran a private surgical center outside Cambridge. His clinic had purchased millions of dollars worth of equipment from Henry's company, and Henry had personally helped him secure financing for a recent expansion. The emergency physician overheard us. "No responsible doctor is going to draw blood from a pregnant woman with severe anemia." Henry met his stare. "You don't know Nolan. I know enough to tell you that removing your wife from this hospital for an unnecessary blood collection would be dangerous." The doctor turned to me. "You are not obligated to donate. No one here can force you." He was right, at least legally. But obligation had never been the only weapon my family knew how to use. My mother took my hand and began crying harder. She reminded me that Natalie was my only sister. My father said I would never forgive myself if something happened while compatible blood was still sitting in a vehicle somewhere on the highway. Natalie remained silent. She did not ask them to stop. She did not tell them that her condition was stable, or that the hospital had already found what she needed. I searched Henry's face, waiting for some sign that he understood how frightened I was. Instead, he drew me into the hallway and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "If Natalie deteriorates while you refuse to help her, I don't know how I'm supposed to live with that. What about what could happen to the baby? Nolan would never do anything he considered unsafe. The hospital doctor just told us it is unsafe. He said he won't approve the donation here. That isn't the same thing. Henry's jaw tightened. You keep acting as though you're the only person in this family who matters. The baby moved beneath my hand. At 19 weeks, the movements were still faint, but I had learned to recognize them. Each small flutter reminded me of how hard Henry and I had once fought for this pregnancy. We had spent 3 years visiting fertility specialists. Henry had undergone one test after another before a doctor finally told us that natural conception was extremely unlikely. When the pregnancy test turned positive, Henry sat on the bathroom floor and cried. For the first month, he treated me as though I were carrying something sacred. He downloaded parenting apps, researched prenatal vitamins, and compared the baby's size to a different fruit every Sunday morning. Then Natalie returned from London. Gradually, Henry began canceling my appointments because she needed help finding an apartment, preparing for an interview, or choosing an outfit for an important event. Whenever I questioned how much time they spent together, he accused me of being insecure. Now he was asking me to ignore a doctor's warning, because waiting 90 minutes for Natalie made him uncomfortable. My mother joined us in the hallway and wrapped both hands around mine. Please, Stephanie, just let Dr. Nolan examine you. If he says it's too dangerous, we'll stop. It sounded like a compromise, but everyone standing around me had already decided what answer they wanted. Less than an hour later, Henry drove me to Nolan Private Surgical Center. My father stayed at Boston Memorial with Natalie, while my mother followed us in her car. The clinic was closed to regular patients that afternoon, but Dr. Nolan was waiting near a side entrance. He greeted Henry by his first name and led us into a small examination room without asking why the emergency hospital had refused the donation. A nurse repeated my blood count. When the result appeared, she frowned. Her hemoglobin is too low. Nolan glanced at the screen and then at Henry. She has been dehydrated. Point-of-care readings can be artificially depressed. The nurse shook her head. Not by that much. Nolan asked her to step outside with him. Through the half-open door, I heard Henry mention the financing agreement between Palmer Surgical Systems and Nolan's clinic. Nolan replied that he understood the urgency, but did not want Boston Memorial questioning his judgment. Their conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When they returned, the number recorded in my chart had changed. Nolan told me he had adjusted the result to account for dehydration. He said he would collect less than a standard donation, and described the risk as manageable. I asked whether anyone had called Boston Memorial to see if the regional blood had arrived. Henry looked down at his phone. There's no update. He had received an update. I would learn that later. The nurse brought me into a small collection room and asked everyone else to remain outside. My mother refused until the nurse warned that she would cancel the procedure. Before inserting the needle, the nurse asked whether I was agreeing voluntarily. Through the glass panel in the door, I could see my mother crying in the hallway. Henry stood beside her with his arms folded. I knew I could still say no. The hospital had already told me it was unsafe. The blood Natalie needed was on its way. There was no medical reason for me to be in that chair. But I also knew what would be waiting for me if I refused. My parents would tell everyone I had abandoned my sister. Henry would spend the rest of the pregnancy treating my decision as proof that I was selfish and heartless. Years of being told that Natalie was more delicate, more promising, and more deserving had taught me to mistake surrender for love. Yes, I said quietly. The nurse studied my face for a moment before starting the collection. At first, I felt only the pressure of the needle and the tightness of the cuff around my arm. Then the baby began moving. The movements were sudden and sharp. Nothing like the soft flutters I had become used to. I shifted in the chair and placed my free hand against my stomach. I feel dizzy, I told the nurse. She immediately stopped the collection and reached for the blood pressure monitor. The room darkened before she could fasten the cuff around my arm. I heard her call for oxygen. Someone shouted that my blood pressure was falling. Henry entered the room and asked whether they had collected enough for Natalie. Then I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was back at Boston Memorial Hospital. A fetal monitor was strapped around my abdomen, and an 4-line ran into my arm. My obstetrician, Dr. Elaine Brooks, stood beside a maternal fetal medicine specialist I had never met. Neither doctor offered the kind of reassuring smile doctors use when they expect everything to be fine. "You experienced a severe drop in blood volume and blood pressure," the specialist explained. "During transport, the fetal heart rate slowed several times." My mouth was so dry that speaking hurt. "Is the baby alive?" "Yes, but the ultrasound shows a partial placental abruption. Part of the placenta has separated from the uterine wall." I stared at the fetal monitor. "What does that mean?" "It may remain limited, or it may worsen. Blood flow through the placenta is currently abnormal, and we are concerned that the fetus experienced a period of reduced oxygen." The specialist explained the risks carefully. The abruption could cause major bleeding. The baby could stop growing, suffer neurological injury, or be delivered far too early to survive. I turned toward the empty chair beside my bed. "Where is my husband?" Dr. Brooks hesitated. "He left with your family after your sister came out of surgery." "Did she receive the blood from Nolan's clinic?" "No. Blood collected outside the hospital has to be tested before it can be released. The regional units arrived first." For several seconds, I could not understand what she was saying. The blood taken from me had not been used. Natalie had already received the compatible units arranged by the hospital, while I was still unconscious at Nolan's clinic. Dr. Brooks told me that Boston Memorial had reported the clinic to the state medical board. The records transferred from Nolan's center showed that my original hemoglobin result had been overwritten. Later that evening, a nurse returned my belongings. Henry's phone charger had accidentally been placed in my bag, along with a printout from the hospital's automated messaging system. The timestamp showed that Henry had received confirmation that the regional blood was only 30 minutes away before he drove me to Nolan. He had known there was a safe alternative. He simply had not wanted Natalie to wait. I remained in the hospital for 2 days. Blood flow through the placenta continued to worsen, and the monitor recorded repeated periods when the baby's heart rate slowed. Henry sent one text message, asking when I expected to be discharged. He did not ask about the baby. The doctors did not pressure me toward any particular decision. They explained that some pregnancies continued after a partial abruption, but mine carried serious risks because of the ongoing blood flow abnormalities. I could remain hospitalized and hope the placenta stabilized. I could also suffer catastrophic bleeding, lose the pregnancy unexpectedly, or deliver at a stage when the baby had almost no chance of survival. If the reduced oxygen had already caused neurological damage, there was no scan that could tell us exactly how serious it would be. Ending the pregnancy would require an inpatient medical induction. It would not be quick, painless, or emotionally simple. Because of Henry's fertility condition, another natural pregnancy was unlikely. I met with 2 specialists, a hospital counselor, and an independent patient advocate. During the second night, I listened to the fetal heartbeat slow, recover, and then slow again. I loved the baby. That was what made the decision unbearable. I also understood that I could no longer depend on Henry to protect either of us. He had ignored an emergency physician, pressured a private doctor, and watched an anemic pregnant woman give blood that Natalie never needed. I did not yet have proof that Natalie was his mistress. But somewhere beneath all the excuses I had made for them, I already knew. On the 3rd morning, I signed the consent forms for a medical termination. The hospital allowed me to return home briefly to collect clothing and legal documents before I was readmitted. Henry was in the kitchen when I entered our house in Brookline. He was carrying an insulated lunch bag and sorting through the mail. He noticed my hospital bracelet, but did not ask why I was still wearing it. "There's chicken soup in the slow cooker," he said. "You should eat before you go back." I looked at the lunch bag. "Is that for Natalie? She was discharged this morning." "You're taking her lunch. She needs rest and proper food." I had spent 2 nights in a high-risk obstetrics unit because of a procedure he had arranged, yet he spoke as though Natalie were the only patient who deserved care. "The placenta is separating," I told him. Henry set the mail on the counter. "But the heartbeat recovered. It keeps slowing." The doctors always describe the worst possible outcome. It protects them from lawsuits. They believe the baby may have suffered oxygen deprivation. His expression tightened. Why do you insist on assuming the worst? I could not understand how the man who once compared our baby to a piece of fruit every week had become irritated by the possibility of losing that child. You knew the regional blood was almost at the hospital, I said. Henry looked away. They couldn't promise it would arrive before surgery. Natalie was stable. I was not taking a chance with her life. You took one with mine. It was supposed to be a small collection. I collapsed. Nolan said that should not have happened. Nolan changed my blood result because you pressured him. I didn't tell him to falsify anything. You took me to him after an emergency physician refused. Henry rubbed the bridge of his nose. I was trying to help your sister. She never used my blood. That doesn't change what we knew at the time. You knew the regional units were only 30 minutes away. He went still. I had not told him about the printed message. His reaction confirmed that he remembered receiving it. The important thing, he said slowly, is that both of you survived. The pregnancy may not. You don't know that. I know you left without asking whether the baby was alive. Natalie had just undergone surgery. And I had just been brought back unconscious. His frustration finally broke through. You have spent this entire pregnancy expecting everyone to reorganize their lives around you. I expected my husband to care whether our child survived. If you hadn't scheduled another prenatal appointment that morning, I would have been available to drive Natalie. She wouldn't have taken my car, and none of this would have happened. I stared at him. My appointment made her run a red light? She was distracted. Why was she driving your car? Hers was being serviced. She could have called a rideshare. She needed to talk to me. About what? Henry looked toward the front window. That has nothing to do with the accident. It has everything to do with it. I stepped closer. What was so urgent that she had to message you while driving? He reached for my face and caught my chin between his fingers. Stop using her accident to turn yourself into the victim. His grip hurt, but the pain brought an unexpected clarity. For months, Henry had canceled appointments whenever Natalie called. He had paid her rent after she returned from London, taken her to dinners he described as business obligations, and become defensive whenever I questioned how much time they spent together. He had not been behaving like a concerned brother-in-law. I pulled away. You blamed my pregnancy for her accident because you don't want me asking why she was trying to reach you. You could have made one sacrifice for your family without turning it into a performance. A bitter laugh escaped me. Henry slapped me hard enough that my hip struck the kitchen counter. For 1 second, he looked shocked by what he had done. Then his face closed again. You make everything impossible, he said. He picked up Natalie's lunch and walked out. I waited until his car left the driveway before photographing the swelling along my cheek and calling Michael Dawson. Michael was my attorney and a managing director at Dawson Private Trust, the independent trust company my grandmother had appointed to administer her estate. My parents liked to imply that they controlled my inheritance, but legally they had never been trustees. Until my 30th birthday, they were allowed to advise Dawson on certain family distributions. That limited influence had been enough for them to convince Henry that I would never make a financial decision without their approval. I had turned 33 weeks earlier. Under the terms of my grandmother's trust, control over the investment portfolio, real estate, and voting shares transferred to me on that birthday. My parents knew the date had passed, but they assumed I would continue allowing them to speak for me. Henry had never read the trust documents closely enough to understand what had changed. I told Michael about Nolan's clinic, the altered blood result, and the assault. He instructed me to send photographs, download my medical records, and remain inside until the police arrived. By that evening, a judge had approved an emergency restraining order preventing Henry from returning to the Brookline house or contacting me directly. The house had belonged to my grandmother and remained inside the trust. The prenuptial agreement Henry signed before our wedding clearly identified it as separate property. I returned to Boston Memorial the following morning. Before going upstairs, I heard Natalie laughing in a private recovery room near the surgical wing. Her door was open. She sat upright wearing makeup and a silk robe. My mother was arranging flowers by the window, while my father watched a baseball game on television. Henry sat beside Natalie, peeling an apple. "You're acting like I almost died," she said. "You lost a lot of blood." "I only needed a transfusion and a few stitches." "You still need to take care of yourself." There was a softness in his voice that had been missing from our marriage for months. A nurse stepped into the hallway with Natalie's chart. I introduced myself and asked whether my sister had ever been in immediate danger while waiting for the regional blood. The nurse checked the notes. She had significant blood loss, but her vital signs remained stable. The surgical team expected the units to arrive before they were required. So she would not have died if she waited? Not according to the attending physician's assessment. Natalie noticed me before I could ask anything else. "What are you doing here?" My parents turned. Henry stood. "You should be resting," he said. "The blood center was already sending compatible units before you took me to Nolan." My mother folded her arms. "We did what we believed was safest. For Natalie. She was the one undergoing surgery. And I was pregnant." My father muted the television. "Why are we still arguing about this? Natalie recovered, and you are standing here. The baby may have suffered permanent oxygen deprivation." The room became quiet. Natalie reached for her water. As she lifted her hand, the sleeve of her robe slipped back and revealed a diamond bracelet around her wrist. It had belonged to my grandmother. "I kept it in the safe in Henry's home office." "Where did you get that?" Natalie covered it with her other hand. Henry stepped between us. "You opened my safe? You never wear it. That didn't make it yours. We're married, Stephanie." It was inherited property covered by our prenuptial agreement. Natalie gave an impatient sigh. "It's only a bracelet." "Then return it." She did not remove it. Instead, she looked at Henry. The familiarity of that glance told me more than either of them intended. My phone rang. The maternal-fetal medicine unit was ready for the final scan before the induction. When I turned to leave, Henry followed me into the hallway. "What induction?" I looked at him. "The doctors are treating the damage caused by the blood collection." He reached for my arm, but I stepped away. The restraining order had not yet been served, and I did not want to tell him about it while I was alone in the corridor. The termination began the next morning. Medication induced labor long before my body was prepared to deliver. A nurse remained beside me through the worst hours, adjusting the pain medication, and holding my hand whenever the contractions became too strong for me to speak. When it was over, the hospital asked whether I wanted to see the baby. I said yes. For several minutes, I held the child Henry had once called a miracle. I studied the tiny hands and the soft curve of a face that would never grow older. I apologized for the family the baby had been conceived into, although none of what had happened was the child's fault. Henry did not call. Later, Michael obtained a transaction record showing that Henry had used a Palmer Surgical Systems corporate card to take Natalie to dinner that evening. The receipt included a bottle of champagne. I was discharged 2 days later. By then, the restraining order had been served, the locks had been changed, and a private security officer was stationed inside the gate. Henry arrived shortly after noon, shouting that his cards had stopped working. I stood on the front steps with my hospital discharge folder beneath one arm. "The company's revolving credit line was suspended this morning," he said. "A payment for the new manufacturing facility failed, and every trust-backed card has been declined." "What did you do?" "I revoked access to my trust." "You can't do that without your parents." "I no longer need their approval." Henry stared at me. "What are you talking about?" A security officer passed him the notice Michael had prepared. Dawson Private Trust held 41% of the voting shares in Palmer Surgical Systems. The trust also guaranteed a $62 million revolving credit facility and controlled 2 seats on the board. Henry had built a public identity around being a self-made founder. In reality, my grandmother's trust had supplied the capital that allowed his company to survive its first 5 years. The arrangement was not a gift. It was a commercial loan governed by documents Henry had signed before our marriage. He read the notice twice. "You cannot demand repayment in the middle of an expansion." I haven't demanded the entire balance. I suspended and used credit, revoked the guarantees, and requested a forensic audit. His face changed. An audit of what? Every payment made to Natalie. His gaze shifted toward the folder in my hand. The name of the obstetrics department was printed across the top. What happened to the baby? The placental damage continued. The doctors believed the pregnancy was becoming dangerous for me, and that the baby may have suffered severe injury. I chose a medical termination. For several seconds, Henry did not move. No. The procedure is over. You knew this might be my only child. I knew. Then how could you make that decision without me? The blood came from my body. The placental abruption happened inside my body. I went through labor inside that hospital while you were drinking champagne with Natalie. His face crumpled. You should have called me. You left without asking whether the heartbeat had recovered. I thought you were stable. You also thought Natalie should not have to wait 30 minutes for blood. Henry approached the gate. I never wanted the baby to die. You were told the procedure was dangerous. I trusted Nolan. You ignored the emergency physician because Nolan owed you money. I was afraid for Natalie. And I was your wife. He began apologizing. He blamed fear, panic, and poor judgment. He promised to find a marriage counselor and insisted that nothing between us was beyond repair. Then he lowered himself onto his knees outside the gate. A month earlier, the sight might have made me open it. This time, I remained where I was. You are not grieving our marriage, I told him. You are grieving the child you cannot replace and the financial security you assumed would always belong to you. That isn't true. Then explain why Natalie had my grandmother's bracelet before the accident. His head rose sharply. I had not known when he gave it to her. His reaction answered the question. The forensic audit began 3 days later. Because the trust held the largest single block of voting shares, I attended the emergency board meeting with Michael and an independent accountant. Henry arrived expecting a discussion about the suspended credit facility. Instead, the accountant displayed 2 years of payments issued to Natalie under a consulting agreement she had never signed. The company had paid her apartment rent, graduate school application fees, international travel, designer purchases, and private medical bills. The expenses were recorded as marketing research and strategic consulting. Then the hotel charges appeared. They came from weekends when Henry told me he was attending medical conferences in New York, Chicago, and Washington. Each reservation listed 2 guests. Natalie's name appeared on room service receipts and spa bookings. The company's cybersecurity team had also recovered messages from Henry's work phone. The affair had begun 6 months earlier, shortly after Natalie returned from London. Some messages were emotional. Others left no room for interpretation. Natalie complained whenever Henry attended one of my prenatal appointments. Henry assured her that the baby would not change what they had together. The car's connected system had preserved the unfinished message Natalie was typing before she ran the red light. You said you would skip her appointment. Are you choosing her now because of the baby? She had been driving to confront him. Henry had not endangered me because he was merely frightened for his sister-in-law. He had done it because Natalie was the woman he had chosen, while my pregnancy had become a complication they both resented. The board voted to suspend Henry as chief executive pending completion of the audit. He turned toward me after the vote. You planned all of this. I requested an audit. The records were already there. Palmer Surgical Systems survived, but only after the board removed Henry permanently and negotiated new financing with Dawson Private Trust. He lost his position, his control over the company, and the reputation he had built by pretending my inheritance played no role in his success. The police also reopened the accident investigation. Natalie had not been authorized to drive Henry's car. A junior employee at Palmer Surgical Systems initially claimed he had been behind the wheel. Henry had promised to pay the employee's medical debts in exchange for taking responsibility. When the employee learned that he could face prison, he confessed and turned over Henry's messages. Natalie was charged with reckless driving and filing a false police report. Henry faced charges connected to insurance fraud and obstruction. Natalie's graduate program withdrew its admission offer after the charges became public, and investigators revealed that her application expenses had been paid through fraudulent corporate consulting payments. My parents spent most of their savings on her legal defense. They came to the house once, demanding that I use my position on the board to protect her. My mother stood outside the gate, crying, "She's your sister. You cannot destroy her future over one mistake." One mistake did not create 2 years of hotel receipts. Henry was older. He took advantage of her. Natalie was 27. She knew he was married. "She has always been more emotionally sensitive than you." That sentence carried the weight of my entire childhood. Natalie had always been more sensitive, more promising, and more easily hurt. Whenever she wanted something that belonged to me, my parents called surrender an act of maturity. My father pointed toward the house. "After everything this family has done for you, you owe us some loyalty." "What exactly do I owe?" "We raised you. You raised me to believe Natalie's happiness should always be paid for with something taken from me." My mother shook her head. "We never said that. You didn't need to." I asked security to close the gate. The divorce took 8 months. Henry tried to argue that the trust assets had become marital property, but the prenuptial agreement was explicit. The Brookline house, inherited investments, trust distributions, and voting shares remained separate. The company financing had always been documented as a commercial transaction, rather than a marital contribution. After the misused funds were accounted for, Henry kept only the property purchased through his verified personal income. The criminal cases ended in plea agreements. Henry avoided a lengthy prison sentence but received probation, substantial fines, and restrictions that prevented him from serving as an executive in a regulated medical company. Natalie received court supervision and lost her place in graduate school. My parents continued supporting her. Their calls to me eventually stopped. On the day the divorce became final, Henry waited outside the courthouse holding a folded knitted blanket. I recognized it immediately. He had bought it after our first ultrasound and joked that the baby would outgrow it within a few weeks. He looked older. The tailored suits and polished confidence were gone, and exhaustion had hollowed his face. "I found this in storage," he said. I stopped several feet away. "What do you want me to do with it?" "I don't know." He looked down at the blanket. "I think about the baby every day. I carried that child. You don't need to explain what remembering feels like." His eyes filled with tears. "I did love you, Stephanie. You loved being forgiven. That isn't fair. You had many opportunities to make a different choice. You chose Natalie when I needed a doctor, when I needed food, and when the hospital told you our baby could be harmed. I made the worst mistake of my life. Calling it a mistake makes it sound accidental." He lowered his head. "Do you think you will ever forgive me?" Forgiving him did not require allowing him back into my life. "I forgave myself for staying after you first showed me who you were," I said. That was the forgiveness I needed. I left him outside the courthouse holding the blanket. Several months later, on the date that would have been my child's first birthday, I returned to the hospital's memorial garden with a white rose. There was no grave. The hospital had placed a small stone beneath a flowering tree for families who had experienced pregnancy loss. I sat there until the late afternoon light moved across the path. For a long time, I believed leaving Henry meant admitting that I had failed to save my marriage. Eventually, I understood that the marriage ended the moment he decided my body was an acceptable price for Natalie's comfort. The divorce only made that truth official. I placed the rose beside the stone and rested my hand against its cool surface. "You deserved a father who would have protected you," I whispered. The wind moved gently through the branches. When I left the garden, the grief came with me. Punishing Henry and Natalie had not erased it. Reclaiming my inheritance had not made me whole overnight. What had changed was that no one else controlled the direction of my life. For the first time, the future belonged entirely to me.